We have our singing geographer, Professor Warwick Murray of Victoria University's Geography Department in the studio now. Welcome, Warwick.
Hello there, Emma. How are you? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And they're a favourite of yours too, aren't they?
Oh, they certainly are. I love that band. In fact, every year when we start class in our Globalisation, Geography of Globalisation class, I play Ojos de Brujo because I think they epitomise really the positive potential of globalisation as opposed to the negative connotations that we often ascribe to it. And subsequent to that, I often play them again in class and finish by saying, globalisation can be good, and Ojos de Brujo are a very good example of that.
So globalisation is the first of the 3 challenges for the planet that we're talking in this series over summer nights.
That's right.
So let's just start with, what is it, in your opinion, a geographical definition of globalisation?
Well, as you know, Emma, globalisation has many different definitions, and often it varies according to one's politics. But in an objective geographic sense, globalisation refers to the stretching of social relations across space, political, economic, cultural, and in a way that transcends national borders, in a way that becomes truly global in scope, so unifying parts and corners of the planet that have never before been unified. So in a sense, it's a process and an agenda which shrinks space. It annihilates space through time, to quote David Harvey, a famous geographer. But there are a number of fallacies and misconceptions about the process that stem in some ways from that kind of definition. And the first would be that globalisation merely homogenises everywhere, makes everywhere the same. And people, often with very good reason, fear that globalisation is indeed turning us culturally and economically and in every other way into a unified, homogenised entity. But this is very much not the case, and geographers are very sensitive to that. That's the first thing. So globalisation is not a blanket. The second thing that's important about globalisation to remember from a geographic point of view is those relations that we're talking about that stretch across space actually take place between humans and in particular places. So this means that globalisation is actually humanised, it's actually created by humans, it's practiced by humans, and therefore that's politically very important because it means that humans can change it. Globalisation is not inevitable. It is not taking over the world in some kind of dastardly plot, although the form that it's currently being practiced in might well be very damaging. And then finally, there's the argument often heard that globalisation is brand new and it came along with the internet or maybe supersonic flight or Elvis Presley or something like that. Well, which is, again, another good form of globalisation, by the way. But the fact of the matter is, geographers have long argued that globalisation goes back a long way in history, at least to the start of the 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the kind of forerunner of the global economy was established through Spanish colonialism. So it's long, it doesn't homogenise, and it's human.
Right. Well, maybe we can start with the not homogenising, because for me personally, when I think globalisation, the first thing I think is Walmart's coming to town.
No, absolutely. And that is definitely one side of the process. The process is, as many processes in social sciences are, and today we're talking, of course, about a process in social science more generally, beyond the remit of human geography. They're often two-sided, and this is very much the case with globalisation. And yes, there are elements of globalisation that lead to homogenisation. There are elements that are centralising the global economy. There are elements that are shoring up the wealth for the minority. So globalisation is leading to uneven outcomes. But there are also other sides to it. There are positive aspects to it, very, very much so, and there are resistances to it as well. The thing is, globalisation then occurs in and across specific networks, and some people are not plugged into those networks. Now, by definition, they will be affected relatively by the operation of the processes of globalisation, but they are not necessarily themselves plugged in. So the gaps in the net are often bigger than the bits in between. So in other words, it's along networks, and often very privileged networks, that globalisation proceeds. So yes, Walmart spreading out across the globe, McDonald's, Burger King, that kind of thing. It's absolutely true that it's become problematic in an economic sense, but there's an awful lot of resistance to it as well. in an economic sense, in a cultural sense, and in a political sense. And new hybrids are being created all the time.
Which is the point of it being about fusion as well between people. Yeah,
absolutely, it is. And in some ways, that's the kind of that's the seed of promise in the whole thing. It's that kind of hybridisation that's created. Geographers often refer to this process as globalisation. They
Localisation.
Say globalisation. I know. You see,
that's... Come undo that for me, would you?
Well, that's one of those words, isn't it, that you could, go in from university and say to your dad, "Now that was worth the fees, wasn't it?" Because there's a word that nobody understands and I can barely pronounce, and so that's what university is all about. No, but globalisation is the concept whereby global processes unfold in local places, and every place is unique. And given that, the outcome of that fusion of global and local leads to a new hybridised, ultimately very distinct outcome. And examples of this include all sorts of things, but the cultural world is often a useful example. In music, for example. So Ojos de Brujo that we were just listening to there, amazing example of this. They fuse flamenco, jazz, a little bit of funk, hip-hop, all in the particular place of Barcelona, and if it wasn't in Barcelona it wouldn't sound like that, and it comes out sounding beautiful. And then of course that model, really, if you like, is then retransmitted back up into the globe and touches down in other localities and makes other fusions possible. So the outcomes are infinite and differentiated according to geographers, and that's what we call globalisation. But that is not to say that there are some very powerful forces at work economically that could, without resistance to them and without correct regulation, come to dominate and to suffocate many of those positive potential hybrids.
Is it to the detriment of local culture and tradition, though, this globalisation?
Well, that's right. You could argue that it is, and again, there's been extensive research on this. I can point you towards research in the Pacific, for example, where we've seen the impacts of tourism, and in tourist enclaves in places like Fiji and Samoa and so on. And I was there recently, so I've seen this in action quite recently. And I used to work at the University of the South Pacific, so I've seen this in action. Locals are often contracted to come and entertain guests, and they do it in such a way, again with music and dance and so on, in such a way that incorporates some elements of tradition, but of course modernises it in a way that makes it palatable, really, and consumable to those people that are on their holidays. And some people argue that this really fossilises and kind of prostitutes the culture in a way that's very inappropriate. Other people argue that in fact it helps preserve it, because without it, given urbanisation, given other commercialisation processes that are going on in the islands, that are pulling people away from their village setting, leading them to live in towns, often away from their community groups and so on. They don't practice their culture like they used to, and tourism offers this kind of opportunity. So again, there are costs and benefits. Strictly speaking, though, yes, I think what you say is true. It is quite possible that hybridisation could in fact end up eroding all of the traditional cultures. But you have to remember as well that culture itself is always evolving. Culture has never been static. Culture in itself is a process, really, and has been changing and probably should change forever.
So it's quite a slippery subject, really, isn't it?
It certainly is.
What are the frameworks that geographers are using to study globalisation?
Well, there are a number, I suppose, and again, this largely refers to your political point of view. There are, it is a very political concept, really, in many ways, but I suppose there are three broad schools of thought with respect to globalisation. The first would be what we call the hyper-globalists, and these are the people that really celebrate globalisation and think it's a wonderful thing, and it's going to save the planet.
How is it going to do that?
Well, because human ingenuity that has created this wonderful technology is going to mean that we can zap ideas around, and nothing. There will be no friction of distance, and everything will become much more effective and efficient. And that through free market economics and the kind of liberal democracy that is supposedly goes with this, we'll end up with a greater civilization. So the hyperglobalists argue that way, and that kind of finds its way into a lot of right-wing politics, and it certainly has, certainly during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and the anti-globalisation movement really opposed that. The second school would be the sceptical school, and the sceptical school is on the other side. They argue that globalisation doesn't actually exist. They say it's been invented by the people on the other side to justify their project of global dominance and takeover. They argue that the hyperglobalists make it seem inevitable, they make it seem desirable, and they therefore argue that we should open our borders, we should open ourselves to these processes, making ourselves vulnerable, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy according to the skeptics. So to the skeptics, it's a political project of the right, and it's an invention, it's a constructed thing. They say also that the world economy today is no more integrated than it was before the Great Depression, for example.
How do the skeptics feel about the internet?
I don't know, you'd have to ask one, because I'm definitely not one, Emma. They probably wouldn't be able to use it. No, I shouldn't say that. But in between the skeptics and the hyperglobalists, you'd find the transformationists. And human geographers tend to be transformationists. And these are the people that believe that globalisation is real, that culture and economics and politics is spreading its tentacles in ways like never before, more rapidly in terms of velocity, in terms of the extensity, the intensity and so on of the process. It's real. But they also argue that the outcomes can be regulated and should be regulated. And if they are regulated effectively, globalisation can be turned into a process which is positive for human progress rather than, as currently practiced, negative.
When you say negative, are you talking about exploitation?
Mm-hmm.
Have a sip.
I will, thanks. Definitely talking about exploitation. I think many human geographers, not all of them, but many of them, would be of the opinion that as currently practiced, globalisation is really one of the greatest threats that faces the planet. And that's why we've chosen these three concepts, environment, development, inequality, and indeed globalisation. And they argue this because the concept is that it's the form of globalisation, it's the form of capitalist integration, the form of capitalist expansion that has been established, that thrives on inequalities, that thrives on exploitation of the environment, that is driven by the differences between countries, between rich and poor, without which it wouldn't exist. And they trace this right back to the formation of capitalism following the Industrial Revolution, and indeed perhaps even further back to the start of colonialism in the 1500s, or at least global colonialism in the 1500s. So they would argue that the system as it currently stands is one which is very prone to crises, and we face in many ways a crisis of crises. We face an environmental crisis, we face a development inequality crisis, and we face a financial crisis, of course, and capitalism is inherently unstable, according to these thinkers. I'm thinking about people like David Harvey and so on.
Is there does geography provide suggestions, solutions to this, or is it just concerned with studying what's happening now?
It's a bit of both, and of course to be able to try and approach solutions you've got to do the bigger theoretical stuff, and of course the empirical stuff where you actually document what's happening, and geography is pretty strong in that. I mean, what we've been talking about so far is quite high level stuff, really. What geographers actually do on the ground is they go in there and they talk to people, and they measure things, and they say this is happening because this process is occurring in a different place. What can we do about that? How could we improve the outcomes? And they can then work with policy people in order to do that. And I suppose, generally speaking, the idea from geographers that's perhaps most pervasive is that really it's community resilience and community resistance and community integrity really that's important in the face of globalisation. With strong communities and strong resistance movements, we can turn it into something. We can reclaim it.
We've just got enough time for your serious song today. I know. Talking. Can you tell us quickly what this one is about, please?
Sure. This one's called I Watch the Children, and it's a song about the importance, really, of seeing beyond the cynical views of globalisation and so on, and viewing the world with innocence as children might. And I wrote this song when I was watching my little girls, Francisca and Gabriella, playing in the street with they're bilingual, and we were in Chile on a sabbatical, and they were playing with their Chilean friends, and I noticed the way that they integrated was kind of universal, and that's the kind of spirit that predates globalisation, and perhaps we should hark back to.
Professor Warwick Murray, thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. Watch the children playing in the street. Their happy laughter makes me think that as we age we become incomplete. Our bodies grow, our spirits shrink. Children laugh and children cry, they speak their minds, never hide what's inside. Old and rich and wise, they say, but there's no way we could ever find that peace of mind. And as they age, we'll send them off to school, and we will tell them when they're grown, be tough, think fast, and watch your back. Happiness depends on what you own. Children laugh and children cry, they speak their minds and never hide what's inside. Old and rich and wise, they say, but there's no way we could ever find that peace of mind. I watch the children playing in the street. Their happy laughter fills the air. Curious eyes and open minds, living life without a care.
Professor Warwick Murray, that was just gorgeous. Can you tell me about the context of that a little more?
Yes, certainly. That, as I say, that was a song that was written whilst watching my girls play. And again, I want to emphasise that geographers see globalisation as a potentially positive thing. And I think that universal spirit is really important. I mean, I know I'm starting to sound... When I was younger and I was in the band, and we used to laugh at people who thought they were John Lennon. And I'm the kind of guy, if I saw me now, I think he thinks he's John Lennon. But don't worry, I'm not comparing myself to John Lennon. But no
Seriously,
way.
no.
No, absolutely not. No, but the point is, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of a romantic kind of a thought. And I encourage students to express and think about things in that way.
Brilliant. Lovely having you with us. And you'll be back this time next week to talk about...
We'll talk about development inequality, also a fascinating subject.